Since I had been away, the regiment had been involved in plenty of heavy fighting. In late January, each squadron had been involved in Operation Blackcock, supporting 52nd Lowland Division in capturing Heinsberg and Kerschow, in bitterly cold weather and across snow-covered ground. Then, in early February, it had returned to the Nijmegen area to take part in Operation Veritable, firstly under command of the 2nd Canadian Division, and then our old friends, the 43rd Division. The fighting in Cleve had been particularly heavy, and many Sherwood Rangers had lost their lives. On February 10th, Lieutenant Thomas was killed by mortar fire while bailing from his tank, which had just been hit. Also killed were Sergeant Borton, Trooper Davis, and Trooper Valentine. On the 11th, Trooper Loft and Trooper Simpson were lost. On the 13th, Corporal Withlington, Lance Corporal Horworth, Trooper Bull, and Trooper Livingston were all killed. And finally on the 14th, Trooper Jennings and Trooper Sparham lost their lives while reconnoitring the German hamlet of Louisendorf, southeast of Cleve.
Within the borders of Germany, a great gain for the Allies has been the capture of Cleves by British and Canadian troops under General Crearer's command.
It was at this time that German opposition grew stronger, and our air reconnaissance reported that enemy movements eastward from the Rhine had gone into reverse.
Infantry clear the surrounding woods while the armoured columns drive on ahead. Inside the town, these tanks bring their heavy machine guns to bear on buildings held by grimly fighting Nazi troops. In other parts of Cleves, similar scenes of mopping up were ending in surrender or death for the enemy garrison.
Bill Enderby had a permanent injury to his arm and had been medically downgraded, but he persuaded the authorities to let him back and was now given command of A Squadron. I also was to have a new position, for as the Colonel welcomed me back from my course and leave, he told me that I was to have command of the Recce Troop. This was a position I had long coveted, and I had continually pestered the previous incumbent, Ian Mackay, to take me on as his second in command. Now Ian had gone to B Squadron, and the job was mine. I could not have been more thrilled. I only had a few days to acquaint myself with the new command, before we were due to go into action again, so I got down to things as fast as I could. The Recce Troop consisted of about 45 men, and as the name implies, its job was reconnaissance, scouting ahead of the main Sabre squadrons to check roads and bridges, observe enemy positions and provide information on what lay ahead. The troop consisted of 11 Stuart tanks. Each tank weighed 12 tons and had a crew of 4 and was armed with a 37mm gun and 2 machine guns. It was obviously more lightly armoured than a Sherman, but had very high top speed of almost 40 miles an hour and was wonderfully reliable. HQ section had 2 of these tanks, plus a Dingo scout car, while the other tanks were in 3 sections of 3, known as A, B and C. My own crew had Trooper Chalky White as wireless operator, Trooper Arthur Hinnett as driver, and Trooper Tom Trott as gunner. My Dingo was driven by Trooper Bert Crowhurst, while the other tank in HQ section was commanded by Sergeant Pothcary, who was the senior sergeant in the troop. Sergeant Weir commanded A section, Sergeant Nev Hinnett B section, and Corporal Slater C section. The remainder of the tanks were commanded by corporals and lance corporals, so I was the only officer in the troop. The members of the Recce Troop were my first proper command in the regiment, and I was keen to do well. I was aware that I had to earn the respect of the men, and not ask them to do anything I was not prepared to do myself. But once they had come to know me better, and I them, it was clear that I could rely on them in any situation. I may of course be biased, but they really were a first-class body of men, many of whom had much more military experience than me. We developed into a good fighting team and contributed much to the regiment's success in the final months of the war, when there was naturally some concern at being knocked out just before the job was finishing. When I came back from England, Dennis Elmore was away with the touch of the flu, but he returned shortly, so the two of us and Dick Holman shared a room together in Cleve. Dennis was still acting as intelligence officer, and Dick was commanding Regimental HQ troop, so we're all in close touch with Regimental HQ and saw plenty of each other, both on duty and off, as we prepared for the next phase of the advance. This began on February 28th, where we moved out from Cleve towards Goch to support 128 Brigade of the 53rd Welsh Division in an attack on Wies. The move off was hectic because we had little notice, so I was apprehensive about getting my recce troop on the road. I felt an extraordinary excitement. It was the first time for about 3 months that I was going into action, and now I had the responsibility of commanding something bigger than a troop of Shermans. The recce troop, along with C Squadron, A Company of 12 King's Royal Rifle Corps, and a squadron of 43 Division recce, were all put under the command of the new second-in-command of the regiment, Major Basil Ringrose, DSO, and called Robin Force. The job of Robin Force was to flank Wies and come in from the south, so the ground was still muddy and there was not much for my troop to do, so Basil adopted me as his aide, and most of my time was divided between him and the forward troops, giving him the picture. My own crew were furious, as it meant running the gauntlet over a piece of wasteland, which was under observation and fire from the enemy mortars every time we crossed. But we survived. The fighting was fierce all round. We're having to cope with experienced German parachute troops, who fought tenaciously to cover the German withdrawal to the Rhine. This period of action lasted about a week. From Wies we moved on to Kevelaer. The thick woods made progress slow, and we were grateful for the support of the infantry, who appreciated the dangers that the woods held for tanks, and acted accordingly. In these woods, the B Squadron tank of Corporal Turner became detached from the rest of their troop, and while surrounded by the enemy were hit by a Panzerfaust. Some of the crew managed to escape, but Trooper Diath was instantly killed, and Turner was badly wounded with a shattered leg. He was taken to a German aid post, treated, and his leg amputated, but passed away in the night. When the farm was taken the next day, the farmer reported that he was well taken care of by the Germans, and every effort was made to try and save his life. On March 4th, the regiment as a group moved off to capture Ijsum, along with a battalion of the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry in armoured track troop carrying vehicles known as kangaroos. The recce troop was out in front, along with Shermans of C Squadron, who mistakenly opened up on some armoured cars which turned out to be American. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but there were profuse apologies, and we had to appease them by donating a couple of our tank suits, which the American commander coveted. I wanted to get to Ijsum first, and ordered Sergeant Pothcary to come with me, so we entered the town at top speed. No Germans were there, but the place was under shell fire, and I found that the bridges out of the town on the far side had been destroyed. Accordingly, I halted my troop and set up a forward HQ, where Dennis soon joined me. There was still a lot of shelling, which made things uncomfortable, and once a shell narrowly missed me when I was standing in the window of a house. Both window and wall were shattered, and covered with dust and fragments of glass and brickwork, I dived under the adjacent infantry troop carrier for protection. There was another body behind me, seeking similar shelter, and as the smoke cleared, I recognised a familiar face from my school days, that of Ernest Delavine, the driver of the vehicle concerned. I was so surprised that all I could say was, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I dare say he thought the same. But it was one of those happy moments when inconsequential chat delayed the renewing of one's duties. The Colonel ordered up an armoured bulldozer, driven by Corporal Evans, to fill in a shallow part of the river to make a firm foundation for a tank bridge. Evans knocked down a house near the river, and then used the rubble as a bridge. By this time I was asleep in my billet, but Frenchy Horton, the adjutant, came in and woke me up with a fiendish grin on his face. He told me that the Colonel wanted a tank at the next bridge, on the road, to give the engineers some protection against the danger of counterattack. Corporal Morris drove, and I sat alone in the turret. The bridge concerned was about 1.5 miles further down the road, and we soon came to it. The engineers were working on it without much enthusiasm, not helped by some intermittent and at times heavy mortar fire. The scissor bridge was parked at the side of the road, waiting to be put in place. Corporal Morris and I sat there having a cigarette, when suddenly the mortar increased in intensity, and we found the engineers racing back along the road, claiming they were being counterattacked. I then reported what happened to Regimental HQ, and we waited entirely on our own, and with some trepidation. To say that we felt vulnerable would be a considerable understatement, However, apart from some continued mortaring, I could hear nothing, and decided it must have been a false alarm, and sped back to Ijsum to find my runaway engineers. As I arrived at Regimental HQ, I found that Brigadier Prior Palmer was there with the Colonel, and the young white-faced engineer subaltern, who was having to explain to his superiors why he deserted his post, when I had reported that all was quiet. For the Brigadier made his displeasure absolutely plain, by turning to me and saying, "Stuart, you will take these engineers up to that bridge again. You will be in command, and that bridge will be ready by morning, even if you were counterattacked by 20 panzer divisions." Without more ado, we both saluted, and went out, my companion looking rather shamefaced. The bridge itself was finished by first light, with further help from Corporal Evans and his bulldozer. I reported this over the wireless to Regimental HQ. The Colonel told me that B Squadron would soon be up to cross over, and asked would I stay for a while to act as a guide. The tanks were not long in coming, lining the road in one long stream, and accompanied by the Welsh infantry. The first tank to cross the bridge, a Sherman Firefly, had Corporal Ernie Leopard as its wireless operator. It had crossed and moved about 40 yards on the other side, where one track was hit by a shell, and an armour-piercing round whizzed precariously close to the turret. The crew bailed out under machine gun and mortar fire, taking cover in a nearby bunker with some infantry. Meanwhile, all the other tanks of B Squadron pulled quickly off the road. Corporal Morris was up by the bridge on foot, so I was left in the honey sitting right in the middle of the road, which was clearly under enemy observation. I bulled at Morris, who turned and ran back, vaulted into the driver's seat, and we backed off the road. Meanwhile, the bulldozer of Corporal Evans started moving around, as though nothing had happened, because Evans had his earmuffs on and could not hear a thing. Mercifully, nothing happened, and he eventually headed back to Ijsum. After a further 10 minutes of inactivity, I received orders to return too, whereupon I went straight back to my billet, and flopped exhausted into bed. Just half an hour later, my batman woke both me and Dennis up, and Dennis, who had slept very soundly, and had no idea that I had been out, stretched his arms and exclaimed, "What a smashing night's sleep!" I had to resist the temptation to hit him. After Ijsum there were 2 or 3 more days of action, before on March 7th we were withdrawn from the fighting to prepare for the Rhine crossing. We now had nearly 3 weeks rest, firstly at Ijsum for about 5 days, and then billets at Goch. Dick Holman had gone back to A Squadron, so I shared a billet with Dennis at Regimental HQ, while my recce troop stayed in 3 battered houses just down the road. Dennis, Dick and I decided to go into Brussels and travelled down in a jeep. We stayed in some luxury at the Plaza Hotel, lying in bed each morning till about 10, before going across the road for coffee, with waffles and treacle, in the restaurant above W.H. Smith. Then it was shopping for an hour, followed by pre-lunch drink or 2, and the afternoon was usually spent in the cinema. By 6 p.m. we had come thirsty again, so it was time to return to the bar for a couple of hours, before a good dinner, more drinks, and a nightclub until 5 a.m. It was an agreeable regime, and lasted for a few days before the war, rather than our stamina, called a halt. We returned from Brussels to find preparations in full swing for the Rhine crossing, which was to be known as Operation Plunder. The Rhine was about 600 yards across at low tide, and considerably more at full tide, so it was the biggest obstacle we had faced since D-Day. This time the leading tank assault regiment was to be the Staffordshire Yeomanry. They would swim the river in DD Shermans, with which they had been training since August 44. The Sherwood Rangers were to be the reserve armoured regiment, supporting the 51st Highland Division. For a week before the assault we were busy with tank maintenance, loading extra ammunition, rations, and jerry cans of fuel to keep us going if the support elements did not get across. On the night of March 23rd, 21st Army Group's assault was launched under the covering fire of a huge artillery barrage. In our sector, elements of the 51st Highland Division were first across, along with the DD tanks of the Staffordshire Yeomanry, in the area around Rhys. The tanks swam across successfully, but encountered a lot of difficulty on the far side of the river because of the steepness of the muddy banks. Little opposition was met at first, and Rhys was occupied by the 153rd Brigade, but German counterattacks developed swiftly, and the commander of 51st Highland Division, Major General Rennie, was killed in the bridgehead early on March 24th. The next tank regiment across, the 13th, 18th Hussars, was sent in to help consolidate the bridgehead, and then it was our turn. The crossing was made on rafts, each raft taking 2 honeys comfortably. The rafts were timber built on pontoons pulled across by 2 wires, which were operated by barrage balloon crews who had volunteered for the job. It took about half an hour to get over, and there was some artillery fire. We were uncertain whether to stay in the tank and avoid shell fire, or remain outside it in case the raft and tank were hit and sank. The landing point on the other side was treacherous, and it was not easy to get up the bank. I was the first of the recce troop to go across, along with Sergeant Hinnett and other elements of Regimental HQ, and the rest followed later. We assembled in a field near Rees to await the next day and slept on our ground sheets in the middle of an artillery battery, which kept us awake most of the night. For the next week, the regiment fought with various battalions of the 51st Highland Division, mainly around Isselberg and Dinxperlo. Our orders were to break a hole in the enemy line, to allow the Guards Armour Division to move through and exploit our success. A and B Squadron supported 152 Brigade in capturing the area south of Dinxperlo, and C Squadron and the Recce Troop were then to come through and capture the town, along with 154 Brigade. As A and B did not finish their work till 9 PM, we were ordered to wait until first light, when asked to recce the two roads leading north out of the town. The night was very uncomfortable, and at candlelit conference I tried to establish from Jack Holman how far I was to recce. He said the orders were for me to go as far as possible, which I could only presume meant until one of my tanks was hit. Such orders always made me cross with high command, because they were difficult to pass on and explain to my men, who rightly made the same deduction as I had. A and B squadrons had a tough time because the whole area was littered with mines. Sergeant Major Hutchinson of A Squadron was killed when he stepped on a mine while parking his tank on a verge, and Captain Neville Fern was wounded in the same explosion. We were shelled intermediately all night, and then at 3 AM we set off towards Dinxperlo. I led the column myself, and went through to the northern edge of the town, where I halted to wait for more light. The small town had been pulverised by our own artillery. The area surrounding the town was a series of flat open fields and small farmhouses, and with the arrival of dawn I felt generally unhappy about the whole task, and determined to take my time. We all had breakfast, and then I decided not to be operational myself, as we had 2 roads to recce, but to send one section down each and wait myself on the junction to see what happened. I therefore ordered Corporal Slater and one other tank to take the more northerly route, and Corporal Morris the other. I told them to proceed cautiously, advising Slater, who spoke German, to stop at each house to question the civilians about the whereabouts of the enemy. I remained on the junction with Sergeants Pothcary and Hinnett and the rest of the tanks, which would form a large force if there was trouble on either axis. Very soon a report came through that Slater's tank had been brewed up, so I sent Sergeant Hinnett off to investigate, and the Dingo to bring back Slater and his crew. The Dingo returned with Slater and one other soldier, but Slater said in a rather distressed way that Trooper Southam was still inside the partially burning tank, and did not know whether he was alive or not. His tank had been taken out by a Panzerfaust at close range, and the hulk was covered by enemy machine guns, whose fire had prevented him going back to look for Southam. I relayed this report back to Jack, telling him that an effort had to be made to see if Southam was still alive, but that my honey had insufficient firepower to attempt much. I said that infantry and Shermans were needed, and, although he seemed pretty irritated about the whole thing, Jack agreed, saying he would bring the tanks himself. Tanks and infantry arrived about the same time. The infantry company was from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, in the 51st Highland Division, and the company commander, Major J.S. Corcoran, as good as called me a liar for exaggerating matters, since he was sure there was little opposition on this road. My eagerness to reply was tempered by the sight of the DSO and MC ribbons on his battle dress, while his second-in-command sported the MC and bar. Together they made an impressive pair, the more so because both were armed only with walking sticks. The commander told me to show them where the enemy was, and we started to walk up the road. Out of their earshot, I whispered to Jack that this was bloody silly, because round the next corner we were going to be shot to pieces. I warned the other two, but like Felix the cat, they just kept walking. As we rounded the corner, we were met by withering small arms fire, and all ended up in the same ditch. From there, our 2 heroes observed the position and ordered up their men to give us cover, while we towed the tank away. Jack agreed to lay on a barrage, and I told Sergeant Hinnett that we must get the smouldering tank away at the first attempt, to avoid further loss of life, and also find out the fate of Southam. Then, as the infantry came up, I decided to tow the knocked-out tank back down the road, and I ordered Sergeant Hinnett to back the tank right up behind the other, so that we could somehow attach ropes. We reached within 50 yards of the tank, when we became under very aggressive Spandau fire, which drove us to ground. Smoke shells from the tanks of C Squadron gave us some protection, and we were able to dash back along the road, where 2 men from the other side had now successfully attached a towing rope to the smouldering tank, which was now being moved back to safety. On my way I passed the Scottish company commander, lying on a stretcher, with a 20mm shell through his foot. Trooper Southam, it was discovered, had taken a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, and had clearly been killed instantaneously. He lies alone as the only military grave in Dinxperlo Cemetery. During the recovery of the tank, Trooper Duckworth received shrapnel wounds to his back from 20mm fire. He was evacuated to Rees, but died later the next day. The battle now became more of a pursuit, as the bridgehead beyond the Rhine widened every day. On April 1st we moved to Ruurlo, where a viaduct was held by the enemy rear guard, and A Squadron had to deal with it. One troop of A Squadron was cut off for a time, and I went up myself with Sergeant Pothcary to help. The Germans lacked anti-tank guns and their own tanks, but their infantry had no shortage of Panzerfausts. Bill Enderby was up there trying to extricate his troops and was glad of our help. He wanted some German prisoners collected from a big white house, and I decided to go myself, while Trooper Trott covered me with his brain gun. But as I came up to the house, someone took a pot shot at me and I scuttled back. A few minutes later, Dennis and Dick reported that they already had the prisoners. Bill Enderby had pointed out the wrong house, and the other two had nabbed the prisoners first. On the same day, 3 tanks of A Squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Peter Mellows, were sent out across open fields towards the town of Barcham. Suddenly, from a slit trench, a Panzerfaust was fired, directly at Sergeant O'Pre's tank. The tank instantly brewed up, killing O'Pre, Trooper Belton, Trooper Grapham, and Trooper McCracken. Trooper Tommy Potts managed to escape the burning tank. Although burnt and wounded, he tried to recover his crew. When it came under further fire, with only his revolver he charged the enemy trenches, killing several of the enemy, while directing Lieutenant Mellows where to fire, leading to 60 prisoners being taken. Tommy Potts had only just turned 19, and was awarded the MM for his bravery. Corporal Spores in one of the other tanks was wounded when a mortar round landed on his tank. He survived, but lost sight in one eye. Next it was on to Twenthe. The bridge by which we were due to cross the Twenthe Canal had been blown, and the Colonel told me to recce another about 2 miles west. This was at the Locks of Ween. I went on in the Dingo, taking Sergeant Pothcary and Corporal Morris with me. As we approached the bridge, which was on top of a large dyke, I halted the vehicles and told Pothcary and Morris that we would go the rest of the way on foot. I gave orders to the gunners of the 2 tanks to cover us and open fire if we were fired upon. There was no cover at all, so we had to walk boldly up the dyke. The only thing that happened was that a German leaped out of a slit trench at the top of the dyke and disappeared, so we cautiously climbed the dyke and raised our heads over the top. The bridge was directly in front of us. It was not large and had been blown about halfway across. I knew, however, that the Colonel would not be satisfied with this negative and limited information. He would want to know the width of the gap and if it would take a tank, was mined or covered by enemy fire. I knew that I would have to walk across the bridge as far as I could. I rose to my feet and walked steadily towards the bridge, feeling that at any moment the bullets would start ripping into me. On the bridge itself, I stopped at the gap where it had been blown. I could see no sign of mines, but the bridge was clearly no good for tanks, and the only way across was for the infantry to lay planks and walk across them to the other side. Pothcary and Morris had by now joined me, and were probably feeling as vulnerable as I was. A shot suddenly rang out, but missed us by miles. Morris looked up to scan the other bank, and asked in an unsuitably matter-of-fact way, "Have you looked at the opposite bank, sir? Because about 200 yards away in those trees, I can see about 200 or 300 Boche." I looked up as he spoke, and there they clearly were, so all 3 of us turned and ran like hell, pursued by only a few desultory shots. I can only think they were keeping their powder dry for a rather better target. The infantry then laid an attack on the bridge, supported by the tanks of C Squadron. But as soon as the soldiers came down the embankment towards the canal, 4 enemy Spandaus caught them in a deadly crossfire. 2 officers and 2 NCOs were killed, and 25 others wounded, and the attack at that point had to be abandoned. The 43rd Division Commander, General Thomas, now cancelled the direct attack across the canal, in favour of a flanking movement through Enschede.
The Dutch town of Enschede has its first taste of liberty for 5 years when it is freed by the Guards Armoured Division. Holland has suffered terribly at the hands of the Germans, with 1 million acres of its land flooded and its people starved and homeless. But now food is coming in by land, sea and air. All aid is being rendered to this most harshly treated people, whose resistance to the Nazis has never wavered.
Consequently, on April 3rd, we found ourselves on the road to Enschede, and then moving on to Hengelo. The attack on Hengelo was carried out by 7th Hampshires, and supported by B Squadron at the Sherwood Rangers. Later our own Kingsborough Rifle Corps came up together with more infantry from the 5th Dorsets and C Squadron from the regiment. Hengelo was a delightful town, one which I remember with particular affection. We were able to rest here for a few days, billeted in various houses, sleeping in really comfortable beds, and being royally looked after by the local people. We were able to see for ourselves, in contrasting ways, what the Dutch had suffered during 5 long years of occupation. My particular affection for Hengelo rests on the fact I celebrated my 21st birthday there, on April 5th. The officers of the regiment laid on a party which was attended by many of my friends, including Dennis and the two Holmans. A band played Happy Birthday, and we sat down to a 7-course meal with champagne. I reflected on the fact that my life had come quite a long way since my last birthday, 2 months before D-Day, but now I'd come of age in more ways than one. It was a wonderful evening, and it remains the only birthday of my life of which I have any distinct memories. I shared a billet in Hengelo with Dennis, and had plenty of time to talk to him. Both of us were aware that the war was drawing to a close. We knew that the Russian army was on the outskirts of Berlin, and that our own progress was quickening now that we were across the Rhine. Our thoughts were beginning to turn to the future, and I remember telling Dennis of my wish to stay in the army. Dennis too wanted to stay on, a decision he had arrived at some time before. A new officer, Peter Kent, turned up from England. He had an interesting background, for he was in fact German, of Jewish parentage one side. He had come to England after his family had been terrorised, and become naturalised under an English name. Because he spoke fluent German, he was invaluable as an intelligence officer, and that was the role he now took on in the regiment, taking over the job from Dennis, who was due a return to a Sabre squadron. I did not like this one bit, because I did not believe he was fully fit. He'd only recently recovered from a nasty bout of flu, and I believed that the wound he had received in Normandy was still affecting him. I therefore spoke to the doctor on the quiet, and he must have done something, because Dennis was made liaison officer to Brigadier Code, commanding 130 Brigade, a position which was meant to keep him out of harm's way. On April 9th we started moving forward again, leaving Hengelo with regret, but with many friendships made and shared. Later, a street in Hengelo was named after the regiment. It's now only 29 days before the war in Europe ends, but the regiment still has many hardships ahead as they push further into Germany.